You see, the faith of James, the man who read this particular, or wrote this particular passage, James, the half-brother of Jesus, the senior pastor of the first Jerusalem church, the first church, as a matter of fact, his is not a faith that lives only in his head. James's faith is not merely creedal. You see, it's not the kind of faith that knows what to say. That's not James's faith, but not what to do. James's faith is not a Sunday school faith. And I don't mean any disrespect at all to those who go to Sunday school, but it's not a Sunday school faith. His faith, the faith of James, is a most practical faith. It is observable, it's costly, and it's real. And I want to ask you that tonight. Is your faith observable? Is your faith costly? Is your faith real? Because that's the kind of faith that James has. It's the kind of faith that actually makes a real difference in the world. You see, when all is said and done, unless the faith that we profess changes not only how we think, and sometimes we do make that mistake, our faith remains in our head, between our ears, but unless the faith that we profess changes not only how we think, but what we do, how we live our lives, in other words, in the secular space as well as the sacred space, outside of the church as well as inside the church. The prayer room, yes, but also the family room, the bedroom, the board room. If lives aren't changed there, then whatever else it is, it's not the kind of faith that James is talking about. And what is the kind of faith that James is talking about? Well, the kind of faith that James is talking about is the Christian faith. The Christian faith. Christian faith, says James, it changes people from the inside out. The Christian faith changes the world, in fact, one person at a time. The Christian faith changes the world one community at a time. And it changes how we see ourselves, and it changes how we see others. And most importantly, it changes how we relate to others. And I hope that's something that you've seen as we've been making our way through this really important letter. But first of all, let me begin by asking a question. What connects this passage with the passage that we read last week? Is there a connection? Or is James randomly jumping from one problem to another, seemingly unrelated problem? It can seem that way at times when we read James. And for what it's worth, I think there is a connection. And it's a connection that sits at the forefront of almost every error that Christians are prone to make. And for that reason, this is a really, really, really important passage. And so what is it? What is that error? Well, that error is this: having no thought or little thought of God. Christians make that error all the time, having no thought or little thought of God. Firstly, writes James, you have no thought of God in your planning. And he's almost certainly here talking to those believers who were merchants, buying silver in Ephesus perhaps and selling in Rome, or pottery in Corinth and selling in Athens, hoping to make money, planning to secure their future. Now buying and selling and planning for your future is fine. It's good, in fact. But James asks this question. He asks, where's God in it? In your planning. Where's God in it? In all of the uncertainty. And what about those things that you can't control? Now remember what James has been dealing with in the first 12 verses. A great many Christians had given no thought whatsoever to the God in whose image those they were now quarrelling with were created. They were giving no thought at all to God. They were gathering to praise God, yet they were fighting and quarrelling with those who had been created in his image. All they saw as they met with other Christians, all they saw were adversaries to be conquered. You ever felt that way about someone? Adversaries to be conquered. All they saw was an argument to win. All they saw was a point to prove. Who's never said that themselves? Well, it's the principle. It's the principle. And James will have none of it. James will have absolutely none of it. And so James, in effect, he asks them, well, how did God look at you? How did God look at you? Did he quarrel with you? Did he stand over you? Did he seek to establish his superiority? Did he judge you? As you now judge your brothers, as you now judge your sisters. Did God judge you? Is that what God did? Or did he instead forgive you? Did he stand against you? Or did he choose to love you? Well, we know the answer to that question, don't we? He chose to love you, didn't he? He chose to forgive you. God did that at great personal cost. In order to love those who offended him, it cost him. What did it cost him? Well, it cost him his son. And when men and women who have heard the gospel, when they choose to follow Jesus, they also choose to walk as he walked. What do we choose? I'll tell you what we choose. We choose, when we pick up our cross, we choose to count the cost. Not to fight those who offend us, but to love, to forgive. That's costly. Why is it costly? Because we believe the lie, the principle, is what matters. Well, if the principle is what mattered, Jesus would not have gone to the cross. No, we also choose to walk as he walked. Not to fight those who offend us, but to love, to forgive. And many of the Christians that James was writing to, well, it seems they had forgotten that. And James knows that when God is forgotten or removed from their thinking, Christians fall into error. In church, we do it all the time. We do it all the time. Just as they committed murder in their hearts, we commit murder in our hearts. Just as they committed adultery by jumping into bed with the world, we do too, don't we? We do it all the time. And here in verses 13 to 17, Christians were planning their futures without factoring God or his will into the picture. They were making plans without factoring God into the picture. And James warns them that planning their future without thought for God is both arrogant as it is foolish. It's arrogant as it is foolish. So God might well say, I know what's going to happen, but do you? Do you know what's going to happen next year? Do you know what's going to happen next week? Do you know what's going to happen even tomorrow? And God might well ask, why run ahead of me? Well, why do you make plans and leave me out? The series that Rod began a few weeks ago, this particular series is entitled The Lies We Live By. And how many Christians live by just such a lie? I wonder. Planning their future with no thought of God or God's will for their lives. We quarrel with a brother or sister. Why? Oh, because we forget God. That's why we quarrel. Because we forget God. We forget what he's done for us. That rather than judge us, he forgives us. We forget, don't we, in whose image those we quarrel with are made. That's the point that James makes. And now, writes James, you're planning your future by making exactly the same mistake. And so he asks the question, where is God in your planning? Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. Now in this case, it's the prospect of making money that has squeezed God out of the picture. James could be writing to us, couldn't he? He could have written this last week. He could have been writing this to Christians living today. How often does making money become our motivation? It calls to us, doesn't it, Glenn? Stephen? It calls to us, doesn't it? And we listen. Even as Christians, we listen. It makes promises to us. What does it promise? The prospect of making money promises to give us comfort, pleasure, security. That's the promise that money makes to all of us. Comfort, pleasure, security. And as we look to secure our future and grow our assets, if God isn't front and centre, how foolish we are. That's what James says. How foolish we are. It is, as James says so well, we do not even know what will happen tomorrow. Now remember who he's writing to and remember when he's writing. He's writing in the 1st century. And perhaps the ship carrying our wares tomorrow will be lost in a storm. It happened all the time. You don't even know, says James, what will happen tomorrow. All your boasting about how much you're going to make. You don't even know what will happen tomorrow. Maybe the market will collapse. Who knows? And so don't make riches or even the prospect of riches the basis of your security. It is, says James, if that's what you're doing, really shaky ground. In any event, in all of our endeavours, not only finances but every area of life, wisdom asks the question, what would God have me do? That's the question that wisdom would have us ask. What would God have me do? How will God's kingdom be advanced if I take this path? Would God have me marry this person? Would God be blessed if I made this decision? Would the gospel be advanced if I pursued this endeavour? Do you see the problem that James is addressing? He's very practical, isn't he, James? That's why a lot of people don't like him, I suspect. He's very practical. He knows what's going on in our heads. And James knows what's going on in our hearts. Because our hearts are attached most often to our wallets. Is that not true? And James gets it. James got it in the 1st century. Do we get it in the 21st century? Every plan we make is either a step of trusting obedience or it isn't. We either invite God to lead us or we step out on our own. Now, it is good to make plans, but always, church, always make plans seeking God's face and trusting your future to God's providence and not the uncertainties of tomorrow, and certainly not your own wisdom. And whatever you do, certainly in the economic realm, don't let the prospect of making money squeeze him out. Don't let the prospect of making money squeeze him out. Don't let business interests squeeze God out. Don't let dreams squeeze him out. Don't, says James, I'll make it easy for you. Don't, says James, forget God. That's what James is saying. Christian, don't forget God. Why? Because He holds your future, not the stock market, not the size of your super, not your business partner, not the bank, not your husband, not your wife, not your university professor, and certainly not anyone on Facebook. Don't forget God. And so that's the first connection. The second connection that this passage has with the previous passage has to do with their inflated view of themselves. Listen to him. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. That's James's estimation of you. I don't think I could get away with it, but I think James can. What are we? We are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. In verses 1 to 12, Christian men and women, they quarrelled because they looked down their nose on those they fought with. An inflated opinion of themselves, in other words, it justified a diminished view of others. Isn't that true? An inflated opinion of ourselves. And here, Christians failed to consider just how fragile their made from dust lives really were. Not just dust, in fact. What are they? They're mist. What are we? We're mist. Here for just a moment. And as quickly as we appear, we disappear. Without even a trace. 2 generations is all it takes. And no one will even bother putting flowers at your headstone. 2 generations. Tilly, you're gone. You are gone. And I'm gone. Without a trace. And the question surely being asked is this: were we even here? Were we even here? And most of you would have heard of the terrible disaster that took place only this past week as the US and Australia engaged in military exercises off Darwin. 3 US Marines, all young, 3 of them died when their Osprey that they were flying in crashed on Melville Island. And none of them knew as they strapped themselves in on Sunday morning that Sunday would be their last day. None of them knew. They probably had plans for Wednesday evening. Dad, I'll call you on Friday. None of them knew. Christian or not, we are all made of dust, as temporary as mist and just as fleeting. Now please understand that James, he isn't trivialising the Christian life. The Christian life is in no way insignificant. That's not what James is arguing. What he is arguing, however, is how fragile it is. And if today you're riding the wave of success, tomorrow, says James, tomorrow you'll be gone. That's what James says. Tomorrow you'll be gone. Self-importance, church. Thinking you are more than you are. Forgetting that without God, what are we? We are nothing. Without God, we are nothing. So that apart from God, our future really is bleak. You can make all the money in the world and it will result in not 1 second more added to your life. Not a second. No amount of money can make you what you're not. It cannot make you a better person. It won't insulate you from loss. It won't protect you from disaster. It won't shield you from the uncertainties of tomorrow. Uncertainties that you can't control. Uncertainties that you can't control. The drunk driver, the stock market crash, the redundancy. Rich or poor, writes James, all you have and all you hope to be is dependent entirely upon the grace and the providence of God. And it is easy to forget that, isn't it? to get lost in the lies that we tell about ourselves, that we're more than we are, that we're in control of our lives. And please do think about that every time you look in the mirror. Every time you step out of bed. Think about it every time you are tempted to place yourself on a pedestal, to think more highly of yourself than you ought. What does James say? This is what he says. He says that you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. That's what James says. Instead, writes James, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. And what's he saying? And James is reminding us, church, that the God's will always prevails. That's what he's telling us. It always prevails. And church, there are no exceptions. Now, here's why that's a really important truth for Christians to hold on to. Here's why this is a really important truth to never forget. It's important because when you live and work in accordance with His will, you will never be overwhelmed when bad things happen. When you live your life in accordance with His will, you'll never, ever be overwhelmed when bad things happen, when unexpected things happen. The ground won't suddenly open up and swallow you so that you drown in despair. When your company fails, you won't be overwhelmed. Why not? Because you'll know that nothing happens outside of God's will. You know that He's still in control. When your plans for tomorrow aren't realised, you won't be overwhelmed. Why not? Because you'll know that nothing happens outside of God's will. He's still in control. Now, you won't understand it, but you can be confident that God does. You see, while we are making our plans, God is busy making His. God is busy making His. Our plans may fail, but God's plans, they never fail. And there is tremendous encouragement, church, knowing that God holds the future in His hands. He most certainly does. He most certainly does. We might not see what's coming, and often we don't, but God does. And not only does God see it, He directs it. You know who moves the chess pieces? Can I tell you? He does. God is the one who moves the chess pieces. He makes kings and He topples kings. That's what God does. And Christians, says James, should find great solace in that, knowing that the future isn't determined by chance or those in positions of power or even by us. And James says, so don't live as though it were. Don't do it. It's foolish. That's what he's saying. It's foolish. And you know what? And this might surprise you. God doesn't feel the need to consult us. Did you know that? God doesn't knock on your door, Tilly, and say, I'm not sure about tomorrow. What should we do? Well, just leave it with me, God. That's not what He does. He doesn't even consult me. He doesn't consult me. What He does do is reveal to us where the future is headed, and He invites us to step into His plan. That's what God does. He invites us to step into it so that no matter what happens, we can be certain that God has us. And because that is so, nothing can shake us. Oh, how I wish that Christians really understood that. It would make a profound difference in our lives. It would make a profound difference in the life of this church. A profound difference. knowing that nothing can shake us, knowing that no matter what happens, we can be certain, absolutely certain that God has us. And if we forget that, or if we make plans entirely independent of God's plans, that, writes James, is arrogant. And that's what James says. James doesn't mind telling us that. As I said, I'm not going to be able to say that too often before people get tired of me and throw me out the door. But James can say it. And I'm glad he does. In fact, he says this. He says, all such boasting is evil. And why is it evil? Because nowhere in our plans have we made room for God. And that's what James has said. We think that the future is ours to control. You know who makes plans without recognising God's providence? The world. That's who makes plans without recognising God's providence. The world. The world does business and doesn't give God a second thought. Not so the Christian. Not so the Christian. The world is very happy to place God in a box. The world divides time into the religious and the secular. The world divides time into the public and the private. And to do so, says James, really is arrogant. It really is arrogant. Why? Because every area of life belongs to God. God is concerned about your Sunday worship. He is concerned about it. God delights in it. He loves it when his people come together to sing his praises. He is concerned about your Sunday worship. Absolutely he is. But God is also concerned about how you conduct your business from Monday to Friday. God is concerned about your family life. God is concerned about how you vote. God is concerned about how you play. God is concerned about how you spend your money. God is concerned, church, about who you date. God is concerned about who you marry. God is concerned about how you raise your children. God is concerned about how you love your wife. God is concerned about how you treat your neighbour. To make plans concerning any of those things without concern for God really is arrogant. And James goes one step further than that. He says it's evil. How dare we divide our time into the religious and the secular? As if God is only concerned about the 30 minutes that we spend in church on a Sunday. How arrogant when all of time belongs to him. There is no secular and religious. There's only his time. Time that he gives us. And that's evil, he says. That's how the world thinks. Not so Christians. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Now, I don't think we can understand fully what James is here talking about without reading what comes next in James chapter 5. And so I want to leave that for next week. And if I haven't upset you too much tonight, please do come next week and drag a friend or two with you, because this is something that they need to hear also. Because James could have written this last week. All right? Not only what you're hearing tonight, but what you'll hear next week. And so, as I said, I want to leave that for next week. But what I will say is this. James, for the most part, has been addressing Christian merchants, those who are busy making plans, those who have access to at least some wealth. James is writing to Christians who are comfortable. You starting to feel the tension here, church? I hope so. James could have written this last week. James could be living in downtown Beaconsfield. I was really hoping that Rod was up here preaching this passage as I was looking at this. Because it's a hard word. But it is a word written for us. I hope that so many people come next week that they're uncomfortable. Why? Because James is writing to Christians who are comfortable. In other words, probably people not unlike us. James is writing to people of at least some means. It's what James begins to say here, in which he expands in chapter 5. We really do need to heed. Listen to him again. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Now, did you hear him? Those of you who are comfortable, those of you who are busy making plans, those of you who are building wealth, listen to him. If you know the good you ought to do and don't do it, it is sin. Now, what's he talking about? He's talking about how you spend your wealth. And if that doesn't scare you, nothing will. What do you do with your wealth? Do you spend it on you? Is that how you spend it? Has God, in other words, blessed you to bless you? Has God blessed you to bless you? Is the wealth that God has blessed you with intended to make you comfortable? Now, there is nothing wrong with being comfortable. I'm not telling you to live like a hermit. Please don't think that's what I'm telling you, because that's not what James is telling you. There is nothing wrong with being comfortable. But what about your brothers? What about your sisters? What about those that you love who aren't comfortable? And here's the question that James wants to ask us. Do you see them? Or is it nothing to walk right past them? Well, this is a scary word. This is a scary, scary word. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Now, let me finish by sharing with you something that I think is really encouraging. Now, on a number of occasions, this year and last year, I've been made aware of financial burdens carried by a number of families in this church. And they've been really heavy burdens. Burdens that have made backs bend. Difficult burdens. What do you do when you're carrying that kind of burden? Well, thankfully, they had enough grace, courage to talk to me about it. They shared with me their particular difficulty. And I'm also aware of the blessing that God has poured out on the heads of a number of families also in this church, maybe even most families. And so here's the question. What will God say to those Christians who have an abundance? When we know of a Christian brother or a Christian sister in need, what might he say to me? What might God say to you, I wonder? And I think, church, James chapter 4 and verse 17 is the perfect place to look. And I'm just so thankful that at least 3 families who call Beaconsfield Baptist Church home, that they also agree. Without a second thought, they saw the need as I saw the need, and without even questioning it, they met it. They didn't even blink an eyelid. They did ask me one question. I said, how much? And I didn't hold back. And they more than met it. That, church, is how real faith responds. God bless you, Tilly. To bless you. God bless you, Glenn. To bless you. Read James 4 and verse 17. I hope you come next week, because he was gentle tonight. Next week he opens up. Let's pray. Father God, we do thank you for your word. We thank you for James. We thank you that here is a man who understands it. He gets it. He knows that the world isn't fair. And he knows there are some who have and some who don't. And he knows that you call your people to be as generous as you are. You are the God who gives to us without hesitation. You are the God who invites his people to also give. Continue to pour your blessing out upon our heads that we might be a blessing to others, so that many might come into relationship with you. We pray it in Jesus' name.